Hello, neighbors. I am going to present in this recording the sort of the cultural and artistic background for the Romans. I know that reading Ovid is a bit difficult for you. We're not going to address a lot of the allusions that are in Ovid until we get into our actual reading for the lecture. What I want to do here is just to show some of the history. Again, just like we did with the Greeks and the Athenian world, a very superficial history, but something to give you some orientation when it comes to reading the text. So, a brief history of the Roman world and a little bit of art, a little bit of art history, a very important political event that happens that is a context for Ovid and his writing as well. So, let's go ahead and start. Brief history of the Romans, as you can see, pretty brief this will be. I'll skip past these. Oops. Skip that. You can do that on your own if you want to. It is something fun to do if we're in class with each other. Now, this section here, you should take a little bit of time to read when you open up Top Hat, assuming you have Top Hat, which if you're watching this recording, you've had it. It does give quite a bit of detail about some of the deep history of the Roman world. For example, the Etruscans. The images didn't copy over, but that's okay. Maybe I'll go find the images a bit later. Some Etruscan work. Latin culture, or the culture that's around the Roman world. This is the deep history, 300 years, 600-year history for Ovid himself. He's a child of this particular history. And it also gives you a very important section here on warfare and the importance of warfare for the Roman world. So again, I encourage you to read that on your own. So the Republic is, I have the dates here, 509 to 133. That's not really the extent of the Republic. There's a as I have here on the slide already, 200 years approximately of a monarchy. This history and the extrication of the Latin world / Roman world from the Etruscan world is a bit muddy still to this day. The current classicist historical point of view suggests that the Roman relationship to the Etruscans was actually a bit more complicated than just the Etruscans ruled them. They probably had economic ties, and they probably did pay a sort of kind of a fee, effectively, for being a part of the Etruscan Empire, but they most likely were not really deeply integrated into the Etruscan world. That said, after the fall of the Etruscans and in the childhood of someone like Ovid, they would have thought of the Etruscans as being the great cultural marker for the Roman world. They would have thought of them as being sort of the high class members of their history, members of their family tree. Their Roman children were trained in Etruscan literature. They were trained in Etruscan thought. Now, we don't know much about the Etruscan language, actually. So the Romans, while they themselves, the elites at any rate, seem to have studied the Etruscan language, they didn't really pass it on. So we don't have a good we don't have copies of works, Roman works, that are translated into Etruscan or anything like that. But the Romans thought of the Etruscans as this great cultural past of theirs, a little bit like what many Americans think of when they think of England and Britain, as they're not us. We used to be a part of them, and now they are. They're sort of a high mark for culture. Think of that television show Frasier from the 90s. His sort of affected, almost British accent because he was cultured, he was educated. So that's sort of like what the Romans thought of the Etruscans. Now, that doesn't figure necessarily very prominently in Ovid, but Ovid himself was the son of a fairly wealthy nobleman, sort of nobleman in the Roman world, and so he probably would have been trained and educated in roughly the same way as the rest of his Roman compatriots were. So it takes them a while to get to any sort of real democracy or semblance of democracy. Eventually, they do develop the Senate, so it's a bit like an oligarchy running the entire region. The Senate is the wealthy landowners, so they are effectively type of a noble class. They made all the laws. They were aristocratic, so you were born into being a senator. You didn't really, you weren't elected to be a senator. Now, eventually, there is a civil war that breaks out right around that 287 mark, where the lower classes determine that they don't have a voice in this political system, and so they have a general strike. And when they strike, that leads to a lack of product for the noble leeches, and so the rich, who are effectively in many iterations of civilization just leeching off the labor of the lower and middle classes. I mean, they take the excess from them and count that as their profit. They don't have any profit. They don't have anything coming in. They don't have any food, effectively, because the poor laborers are the ones who are responsible for the food supply itself. So that leads to a war. The lower classes, who are called plebeians, and unfortunately I don't have that word, I don't think, on any of these slides, so I will type it up for you when we are in the lecture. But and these terms are important. So the noble classes are called the patricians. The lower classes are called the plebeians. The plebeians eventually win. They win the right to be a part of the democratic political system. Their group of people, called the popular assembly, is democratically elected, and so the plebeians go and elect. Oh, there! I said I didn't have it on the slide. It's actually here on the slide. Well, I don't have patrician on any of the slides, so I'll spell that one for you. And I don't believe I have equestrian, which is the third sort of official class. But so the plebeians win. They become democratic, and they are allowed to veto laws. They are allowed to write laws eventually, and then they slowly fade away as being a political unit. They don't have like a separate house like the House of Representatives for the United States, as opposed to the Senate chambers. They all kind of work together in the same area, and eventually these plebeians become fairly wealthy, and then the wealthiest plebeians are the ones who are elected because they kind of have time on their hands, and then that starts a cycle of, well, effectively you just have a number of very wealthy people running the society. So let me skip this one. This is a little bit how the system works. It's not terribly important for us, so I'm going to skip past it and talk about this. Now, you're going to read more about this when you read that section in Top Hat. War in Rome. Rome is defined in many ways by war, its prowess in war, and the respect that it garners from winning so many wars and so many battles. It is deeply ingrained in their culture, the concept of warfare. It figures into one of the more important classes, the equestrian class that I've mentioned. The equestrians were sort of low-class members of society who gained fame in war and wealth in war, and eventually became Some of them became senators. So, and that actually happened in the Punic Wars. In the Second Punic War, there are three Punic Wars. The first one is pretty much an equal exchange. Neither side really wins. This is the two sides, by the way, are the Carthaginians and the Romans. The Carthaginians are from, roughly speaking, a city in North Africa called Carthage. The Phoenicians, I'm sorry, the Phoenicians are located sort of, that's their capital, a little bit like the Romans have Rome. And it's largely a territorial dispute. Now, the first one ends with kind of a mutual. Well, no, I'm sorry. The first one ends with the Phoenicians losing, and they decide that they're going to yield to the Romans, and that puts them into a position to be able to build up for the second round, the Second Punic War. But one of the things that comes out of this comes out of these Punic Wars is the notion that Rome fought their wars completely differently. From the very beginning of the Punic Wars, it was recognized by, well, it wasn't really completely recognized by the Phoenicians, but eventually they kind of realized this, that Rome did not fight to seek a peace. Rome fought to end the war. Most of the cultures around the Mediterranean were oriented towards this Greek mode of combat and warfare. You fight until you reach kind of a balancing point, and as soon as you feel as though the scales are being tipped against you, then you seek peace with the other side. You pay a fine, you pay some money, you give some slaves, you give some territory, and that's it. It's the end of the war. And both sides are oriented towards thinking about that as the war. If I'm winning, then I'm going to get some money, and I'm going to get some territory, and I'll be happy with that being the conclusion of the war. The Romans didn't fight that way, not the Punic Wars. The Romans fought to end the whole thing. And so it took the Phoenicians a while to be able to seek some sort of peace. And then it was a peace with really draconian measures, which actually put us into sort of the Second Punic War. So the Second Punic War doesn't go as well for the Romans, and in one battle with Hannibal, a large portion of the Senate families were decimated. Now, the Senate families were noble families, all of whom were warriors, soldiers. Their children, the senator's children and nephews, grandchildren, were part of the military. They would go onto the field of battle, the risk of being killed. Senators themselves had a great history of being, at some point, great warriors. And in this battle with Hannibal, the Romans attempt to end the whole thing. They put a large army onto the field of battle. Many senators and senatorial families are there. They lose the battle and are routed and lose close to 50% of the entire Senate and almost all the families. And what that leads to is a shift in the way the Senate is composed. And so then wealthy equestrian families, families who are from the poorer or the plebeian classes, were able to kind of buy their way into being a senator. And potentially wealthy plebeian families, kind of a lower class. The equestrians at least had a type of nobility from being a part of the military. The plebeians were farm families and laboring classes and etc., merchants. Some of them may have been able to buy their way into the Senate as well. The Third Punic War saw the end of the Phoenicians' city, Carthage, and really the end of the Phoenicians as a major culture around the Mediterranean, because the city of Carthage was completely destroyed, and according to tradition, at any rate, the Roman army burned the city to the ground after having slaughtered every living human being or enslaved them, burned the city to the ground, marched over the city, trampling the ashes into the ground, and then sowed the fields with salt so that nothing could grow there. Now that's tradition. I don't really know if all of that happened. And there is a remnant of Carthage from around that date still left in the wastelands of North Africa. At any rate, so those are the stories, and those are stories that signal the real importance of the military, because they are part of the mythical history of Rome. A little bit like World War II is a part of American history, much more deeply ingrained in our history than the Korean War or the Vietnamese War, the war in Vietnam. Both of those wars happened. America was not obvious winners by any stretch of the imagination out of those two wars. And not to say that they are forgotten about. They're not, definitely not. But they're not part of this tapestry of sort of American ideology in the way that World War II is, in the way that the Civil War is to some extent, and in the way the Revolutionary War is. So the Punic Wars are like those World War II, Revolutionary War sort of ideas of the power of Rome, and they get passed on from generation to generation as being great examples of how Rome is great. They weren't always winners, obviously, and really, if you look at the northern border after Caesar, it becomes a bit of a wash until eventually things begin to crumble up there. So the Republic was this period that saw the Punic Wars. It was during the Punic Wars that you get a little glimpse of some of the erosion happening of those great Republican periods, the great history of the Republic. One of the ideas, one of the things that's ingrained in even the Roman Republic was the notion of the dictator. A dictator was someone that was nominated to run the war effectively and have total control over everything until the war was over. Well, total control for a year, I believe, and then had to be renominated until the end of the war. Many of the consuls had that power during the Punic Wars. So that concept of having the dictator run the war and run all of society in order to run the war is what will eventually be the framework that allows Caesar to take over. Now, the Republic doesn't last, well, it does last a fairly long time. It lasted longer than we have currently lasted. But eventually things fall apart. And there are a number of reasons for why this falls apart. All of this, by the way, begins to fall apart well before the birth of Ovid. Ovid himself is a child when Caesar is in power. And then he's a young man when his nephew, Octavian, is the emperor, the first real emperor, even though he doesn't call himself an emperor. And this power, or this erosion of the great period of the Republic is something that Ovid himself wasn't a part of. But the Republic is one of these historical threads in the tapestry of Rome that makes up Ovid's life. Even though he himself doesn't live in a republic, he lives in what is effectively an empire. Even the emperor at that point, Octavian, is attempting to convince people that they are still part of a republic. The Senate is still there. It's still making decisions. Roman society is still roughly the same, etc. And if you had gone back in time, if you could go back in time and speak to Ovid about, what kind of what kind of civilization, what kind of political system are you living in, there's a distinct possibility he may very well have said, this is the republic run by the people. So, some of the reasons for this erosion are the power of the armies, the power of each one of the major army units under several generals. The generals had become very well liked by their soldiers. They were like godfather figures, so that when Caesar is about to return to Rome to conquer the Roman city, the Roman people, and become the dictator, he, notably in the stories about him, he stops at the bank of the river, and this is after he has been exiled on pain of death if he returns to Rome. But the Senate has exiled him, called him a traitor, exiled him on pain of death if he is to return to Rome. And he leads his army to the edge of the river, which is the boundary of Rome, and he turns to his soldiers and he says, look, none of you have to follow me, and I'm not going to blame any of you if you don't follow me. This is my task. I have to go fix Rome. Rome is broken. We all know it. So many people know it. And it's on my shoulders to go and fix what is broken in Rome. You can follow me, and for which, you'll be well, you'll be taken care of for the rest of your lives if you do follow me. But if you don't, there will absolutely be nothing to hold against you. You will have done right by Rome, even if you don't follow me. It's not the details of the speech, but that's the general tenor of it. The speech is written down somewhere, and it's a fictional recreation of the speech after the fact. But it's it's a stirring speech, and his soldiers to the man say that they'll follow him to Rome. They cross the Rubicon, etc. But it's that type of relationship. He's a leader of these however many thousands of men, but he's also like a godfather figure to them. There's an emotional connection between them. And each one of the generals had that emotional connection to their troops to some extent. The troops were dedicated, in other words, to the general rather than to the ideals of Rome. So that's one problem. Another problem is the Senate is filled with a number of very, very rich people who are not really all that interested in the good of Rome anymore. So just like the soldiers are more invested in the general, many of the senators, at least according to stories about them, are much more interested in their own personal pocketbooks and getting as much money as possible and the silliness of sort of political power struggles than they are in actually making Rome work and making Rome a better place or etc. So there's not a lot of respect for the senators, the Senate in general. The concept of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is also deeply ingrained in stories about the fall of Rome. One of the problems with that is that what we know, we don't know a lot. There's not a lot of hardcore data, but what we can piece together about the Roman economy suggests that there was definitely a lack of equality, deep inequality in Rome. It doesn't seem as though it was nearly as bad as what we have in many parts of our contemporary world, for example, in the United States. So what we can piece together suggests that 1.5% of the wealthiest owned about 20% of the wealth. And that fluctuates, could be up to 40% of the wealth. But the top 0.1% in the United States owns, I think, 50% of all the wealth in the United States, and the top 1% owns 80 some odd percent of all the wealth in the United States. So our income distribution, our inequality, wealth inequality, is much more dramatic than that of Rome. And, America hasn't fallen yet, hasn't had another civil war. We're not carrying out our guillotines into the streets and lopping off heads yet. So, so does this economic inequality really mean that much? I'm harping a little bit on this because the economic inequality taps into a class inequality, and that economic/class inequality does mean quite a bit to Ovid, but in the other direction. He is the character, at any rate, as you'll see once you keep reading, is not very wealthy, but is from a class that is traditionally the class that is uniquely in power. And that causes conflict for Ovid's character when another lover will enter the life of Corinna and be someone who is wealthier than he is, but of a lower class than he himself is. So, Julius Caesar, I mentioned him just briefly. He's the one who's going to return and make things more complicated. Caesar is dead in 44. Ovid is born right around that time, I think. So he is either a child. He's born in 43. So he was born after Caesar is already dead. So Ovid is a child when Caesar's nephew Octavian comes to power. So Julius Caesar, as opposed to Augustus Caesar, who Octavian will call himself, is, of course, the direct history, the direct lineage for the emperor, the direct history for Ovid and his family. His family would have lived through this period of instability. And as we know, when it comes to periods of instability, what we know of them is that you oftentimes don't really experience them directly. You experience the side effects from these periods of instability. And so what Ovid would have experienced if his father was a senator. So what Ovid would have experienced would have been his father potentially talking about this time when the Senate was broken up, was told to go home effectively while Caesar ran everything. The massive amount of political instability from the assassination of Caesar, the lead up in the power struggles up to the point where Caesar takes power. I mean, that would have been the history for Ovid as a child. And the Caesar, as far as a character, is not all of that important, except he becomes a godlike figure. And in fact, he becomes a god, according to Roman tradition. He is turned into a god by Octavian. And so this god, or godlike figure, is the father of the period that Ovid lives through and that he enjoys quite immensely, as you'll see from reading his poems, and that he is also afflicted by, because Ovid will be eventually exiled for his writings. The birth of the Roman Empire sees really Octavian stepping in. So Julius Caesar is assassinated And you can read more about this history. You can listen. There's some wonderful ebooks, and there's some wonderful podcasts about Roman history that I encourage you to check out. They give you a lot of these details that I just kind of stumble over because they're not really all that important for Ovid. But Octavian is important for Ovid. So Octavian is the adopted son of Julius Caesar. He's actually his nephew. He is a very young man when Caesar dies. There is so after Caesar dies, Octavian is supposed to get all of Caesar's wealth, but it actually is held in a trust because Octavian is too young. It's held in a trust, and that trust is managed by Mark Antony, who will eventually, of course, be the enemy of Octavian. Mark Antony and Octavian have a bit of a tense relationship. Eventually, Octavian's old enough to take charge of the estate. He does. Because he is a child of Caesar, he has a sort of special inroads in with a number of senators, including Cicero, a senator who is very well known for his ability to give speeches and convince people of things. And Cicero takes Octavian under his wing to train him to try to be a great senator and potentially a great consul, sort of the head of the military for the Roman world. Octavian learns from Cicero and will eventually become more than just a consul. He will be the princeps, the first de facto emperor, after having exiled Cicero, and then Cicero ends up being imprisoned by Mark Antony and bludgeoned to death. And Octavian could have stepped in to save him and didn't. So there's a bit of a typically Roman history between these characters. They are very vicious. So Octavian eventually hatches a plan. So Mark Antony is definitely more in charge of things, and it looks as though Mark Antony is making his way towards stepping into the power vacuum left by Caesar. And Octavian doesn't want this to happen, and so Octavian hatches a plan and has someone steal Mark Antony's will and testament from the sacred temple where they are kept. So the wills and testaments were very important to Roman nobility. They carved them into stone or wrote them on scrolls, one of the two, I don't know. And they put them into this sacred temple that was guarded by priests. No one was allowed into the temple other than the priests, so that there was no chance of having fake wills. There was no chance of having someone change a will. So Mark Antony had been in a relationship with Cleopatra, and they had I believe she was pregnant, or they had a child. No one knew this other than Mark Antony. He changes his will, so he puts Cleopatra and the child in, the potential child, in his will. She is a queen of Egypt, and so is not really a Roman citizen. It's kind of in a relationship with Rome, but not servants of Rome. And so she's a foreigner. And Mark Antony gives her a lot of his stuff, and he gives her a lot of sort of, power, effectively, in Rome by arranging this relationship and arranging things for her after his death. So what Octavian does is he has someone steal into the temple, steal the documents, the will, and then he publishes them. And it causes an outrage. It causes accusations of treachery against Mark Antony. Mark Antony eventually goes down to Egypt, where he and Cleopatra hatch a plan to just lead an army into Rome to overthrow the Senate and take control. That puts Octavian in the position of being the defender of Rome, which is if he didn't plan it, it actually works perfectly for him. So he steps up and defends Rome, the Battle of Actium, where he beats Mark Antony and kills him. Cleopatra kills herself, and Octavian suddenly has the Senate effectively offering to turn him into the dictator if he wants. And Octavian says, no, I don't want that. In fact, what I want is I want to be the first citizen, princeps. This is probably one of the most brilliant strategies in much of political history. He has the chance to take power. He does take power, but he has himself called not emperor. He has himself called princeps, or first citizen. So he reinforces the idea of the republic by having himself a citizen of the republic. He sits in the Senate as a senator. He can change the rules if he wishes. He has control of all the armies. He can modify legislation if he wants. And he does end up writing some legislation, but effectively he turns over all of the managerial components of the state back to the Senate and steps into the position of being a king-like figure, but a hands-off king-like figure. Now this will eventually modify into being the emperor position. So a little bit of political imagery and a little bit of art history here. This is one of the great works commissioned by Octavian, the Augustus of Prima Porta. This is him, representation of Octavian. And there are some striking differences. One, if I skip back to this gentleman, this type of art, which is deeply associated with the period of the Republic, is oftentimes called warts-and-all realism. It is a virtual photograph of the face of whoever this person was. Roman patriarchs, Roman nobility, would have a plaster cast made of their face, and then a plaster bust made out of that cast, and then that plaster bust was used to carve into stone an exact copy of what was in the bust. So this person's face right here is an exact copy of the face that he actually had. This is his face. So that was the method of art for the period of the Republic. What the senators wanted, what the nobility wanted, was an exact copy of their face, so that their ancestors, or so that their antecedents could remember them. They wanted exact copies of the faces of their ancestors, so that they could venerate them and remember them and give offerings to them and satisfy them and make sure that they were still alive in the other world. When we move to the Augustus of Prima Porta, this signals a shift in Roman art from what's called warts-and-all realism to idealism. And this is a type of art that is already very popular around the Mediterranean. It just wasn't very popular with the Romans until this period. Its form around the Mediterranean was called Hellenistic, the Hellenistic style, based on Greek art. It is highly naturalistic, and generally Hellenistic art tends to be much more realistic than idealistic. But what Octavian wants is he wants that Hellenistic naturalism for his body, but his face he has represented idealistically. In fact, we don't really know what Octavian looked like to this day, because this image of his face and very similar images are the only images of his face that we have. He is he's too perfect. Now, this may be generally what he looked like, but it's most likely not an exact copy of his face. Moreover, this image was made, this particular statue was made when he was in his 30s or 40s, and this is not the face of a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old. This is the face and the body of a 20-year-old. So and this could be a part of his purpose here. He could just have been a bit vain in his appearance. So he may have just wanted a perfect image of himself to be the image for history. But this is an eternally young face that he will have up until he's dead. Like I said, there's no real accurate image of Octavian or Augustus Caesar. He also has an emphasis on his military power. So the cloak is that of a general. This breastplate has a mythical battle on the front of it. Everything here signals at this part, signals his military prowess. But the bare feet and the little baby and the hand gesture, they are also important. So the baby here is, and this is a better image, that's why I flipped back to it. The baby here is part of a campaign instituted by Octavian to turn himself into the child of a god. He wanted Caesar to be turned into a god, his adopted father. And so what he did was he hired Virgil to compose a lineage for him, and that lineage just so happened to go back to Venus. So Augustus Caesar is an adopted child, nephew of Julius Caesar, and that lineage goes all the way through Romulus and Remus, through Mars, through Aeneas, and up to Venus. And this is the really important one to remember for reading Ovid, I think. The fact that Caesar is related to Venus. Now, this statue also has deep relationships to this Greek mode of art, this Hellenistic art. So you have this naturalistic body shift, emphasis on the athletic body, kind of a relaxed but powerful body. And you can see it clearly here in the Poseidon of Milos, which is a kind of an average temple statue from the Hellenistic period, 200 years previous to Octavian's statue. And you'll see the striking parallels between them. See how the body goes in this slight S curve and a slight S curve. Hips are bent, or at an angle. So the leg is bent, bare feet. A dolphin next to him, arm extended. Now, does that mean that this artist here copied the Poseidon? No. There's thousands of statues that look almost identical to Poseidon across the Mediterranean in every single temple that you'll stop at anywhere in the Mediterranean world. So the artist who did Octavian is simply using the tradition that has been around for 200, 300 years. But what is striking is that the arm here is meant to rest on a trident. The baby here is meant to reinforce the God connection. So this isn't just a little random Cupid figure. This is his cousin, effectively. It's Cupid, Eros, as in the Eros that we just read about in the Symposium. This is the Roman version of him, hanging out with his cousin, Augustus. Hey, cousin, how you doing? I'm doing fine. Sorry. And so that's a difference. Now, another striking difference is the face is turned. So his arm is extended, his face is directed towards the masses. He, Octavian, is representing himself barefoot, so connected to the earth, a god, but connected, a god, but connected to the people as well. He is addressing the people. That's what that arm extended means. We'll see this again when we get to Christianity. But that arm extended, oftentimes called the imperial gesture, shows that Octavian, or Augustus Caesar, is attempting to connect with the masses. He's communicating with them. He's looking at them. He's addressing them. Now, Roman art is not just idealistic. It can also be deeply naturalistic, especially in painting. I don't want to spend too much time on this. And in fact, when we pick up in our next lecture, we are going to start with Octavian's Constitution and how it affects Ovid. So I'm going to stop the recording here. I hope you found it interesting, and I look forward to chatting more about this when we see each other again in the coming week.